For 3 years, Lady Rosalie Whitmore believed Duke Julian Ravenshire trusted her completely. She was wrong. Long before the humiliation that would become the talk of the kingdom, Rosalie had given Julian something few people ever had: her honesty. Their paths first crossed during a charity fundraiser hosted by the Royal Council. Unlike most young noblewomen, Rosalie wasn't interested in chasing powerful men around ballrooms. She spent her days helping her widowed father manage the estate and organizing aid for struggling families on neighboring lands. Julian noticed her because she spoke to him like a man, not a title. Over time, their conversations became frequent. They discussed books, politics, trade, and even childhood memories. The kingdom began to whisper. Everyone believed it was only a matter of time before the Duke proposed. Rosalie never asked for promises, but she allowed herself something dangerous: hope. At 24 years old, she finally imagined a future that belonged to her. Every invitation from Julian felt meaningful. Every dance felt personal. Every smile convinced her she wasn't imagining what everyone else seemed to see. Even Baron Whitmore, who rarely commented on such matters, once joked that he'd better begin preparing a wedding speech. Rosalie laughed at the time, but secretly she treasured the thought. Meanwhile, Lady Genevieve Sinclair watched everything from the sidelines. Genevieve was beautiful, wealthy, and accustomed to getting whatever she desired. What she couldn't tolerate was being ignored, especially by a man like Julian Ravenshire. She had spent 2 social seasons trying to capture his attention with little success. Then Rosalie arrived without even trying and somehow earned the Duke's respect. The more Genevieve observed them together, the more resentment grew inside her. One afternoon, during a gathering at the palace gardens, she watched Julian spend nearly an hour speaking with Rosalie beneath a rose-covered pavilion. They were laughing together, comfortable together. The sight made Genevieve's stomach twist. That evening she decided if she couldn't win Julian fairly, she would remove her competition entirely. The opportunity came sooner than expected. A month later, the kingdom prepared for the Royal Winter Ball, the most anticipated social event of the year. Nobles travelled from every corner of the realm to attend. Rumours spread that Julian intended to make an important announcement before the season ended. Naturally, speculation exploded. Every newspaper, every drawing room, every dinner table buzzed with one question: would the Duke finally choose a wife? Rosalie tried not to pay attention to the gossip, but it followed her everywhere. Seamstresses smiled knowingly while fitting her gown. Friends teased her relentlessly. Even strangers treated her as though her future had already been decided. It made her uncomfortable, yet a small part of her couldn't help wondering if they might be right. The night of the ball arrived cold and beautiful. Snow covered the palace gardens like a blanket of diamonds. Inside, hundreds of candles illuminated the grand ballroom. Music drifted through the halls. Noblewomen displayed their finest gowns while noblemen exchanged political rumours over expensive wine. Rosalie wore a silver-blue dress that had belonged to her late mother. She stood before the mirror before leaving home and felt a sudden ache in her chest. Her mother would have loved this night. She would have brushed Rosalie's hair and reassured her when nerves threatened to overwhelm her. Instead, Rosalie took a deep breath and made the journey alone. When she entered the ballroom, heads turned. Not because she was the most beautiful woman present. There were women richer, younger, and more fashionable, but Rosalie carried herself with a quiet elegance that drew attention without demanding it. Across the room, Julian noticed her almost immediately. Their eyes met. He smiled. Rosalie smiled back. For a moment everything felt exactly as it should. Neither of them knew Genevieve's plan was already in motion. Earlier that evening, she had delivered an anonymous letter to one of Julian's trusted aides. The letter appeared to contain private correspondence supposedly written by Rosalie. Its contents were devastating. According to the forged pages, Rosalie had mocked Julian behind his back and described him as nothing more than a path to power and wealth. The handwriting had been expertly copied. The details felt convincing. Most importantly, the letter seemed genuine. Genevieve knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't trying to make Julian stop loving Rosalie. She was trying to make him feel betrayed. Throughout the evening, she watched events unfold with growing satisfaction. Shortly after midnight, the forged letter finally reached Julian's hands. At first he looked confused, then concerned, then angry. The longer he read, the darker his expression became. Rosalie noticed the change immediately. She excused herself from a conversation and began moving toward him. Something felt wrong, very wrong. When she reached him, Julian's eyes were colder than she had ever seen them. "Julian," she asked softly, "is everything all right?" He stared at her for several seconds before speaking. "I thought I knew you." Rosalie blinked. "What are you talking about?" Julian pulled the letter from his pocket. "Perhaps you should explain this." Confusion crossed her face. She reached for the paper, but he pulled it away before she could touch it. Around them, nearby conversations began to fade. People sensed tension. People always sensed tension. Rosalie felt dozens of eyes slowly turning toward them. Her heartbeat quickened. She had no idea that within minutes her life would change forever. "Before we continue, I have to ask you something. If the person you trusted most suddenly believed the worst about you without even hearing your side of the story, would you ever forgive them? Let me know in the comments. And if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the truth behind what happened to Rosalie is only beginning to unfold." The silence that followed felt louder than the orchestra. Rosalie stared at Julian, waiting for him to explain, waiting for him to tell her this was some terrible misunderstanding. Instead, he looked at her as though she were a stranger. Around them, conversations died one by one. Noblemen stopped speaking. Noblewomen lowered their fans. Every eye in the ballroom settled on them. Rosalie's pulse hammered against her ribs. "Julian, I don't understand," she said quietly. "Then perhaps you should explain why you wrote this." He unfolded the letter and held it before her. Rosalie scanned the page, her face drained of colour. She had never seen the document before in her life. The handwriting looked similar to hers, but the words felt foreign, cruel, and calculated. According to the letter, she had spent months pretending affection for the Duke, while secretly mocking him and laughing about the wealth she hoped to gain through marriage. "This isn't mine," she whispered. Julian's jaw tightened. "Enough! Julian, listen to me." "I've listened for 3 years." The words hit harder than a slap. Rosalie saw something she had never seen before in his eyes. Disappointment, not doubt, not confusion, disappointment, as if he had already decided she was guilty. "I didn't write this." "Then why does it bear your handwriting?" "Because someone copied it." Julian laughed bitterly. "You expect me to believe that?" Rosalie looked around desperately. Surely someone could see what was happening. Surely someone would speak. No one did. The crowd watched in silence. Lady Genevieve stood near the edge of the ballroom, pretending to look shocked. Inside, she was enjoying every second. Rosalie turned back toward Julian. "Please, let me explain." "There is nothing left to explain." The orchestra stopped playing altogether. The room felt frozen in time. Then came the moment that would follow Rosalie for the rest of her life. Julian raised his arm and pointed toward the ballroom doors. "Leave!" Gasps spread through the crowd. Rosalie stood motionless. She couldn't believe what she had heard. "Julian! Leave this ballroom and do not return." A single tear slipped down Rosalie's cheek. Not because she was embarrassed, not because hundreds of people were watching, but because the one person she trusted most had refused to trust her. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted as she passed. Nobody stopped her. Nobody defended her. The grand doors closed behind her with a heavy echo. Inside the ballroom, Julian remained standing in silence. He expected anger. He expected relief. Instead, he felt something he couldn't explain. For the first time all evening, he looked at the letter again, and for the briefest moment, uncertainty flickered across his face, but pride quickly buried it. Outside, snow fell gently over the palace grounds. Rosalie stepped into the freezing night and finally allowed herself to cry. Not loudly, Not dramatically, just enough to release the heartbreak she could no longer contain. 3 years. 3 years of friendship, trust, and affection destroyed in a matter of minutes. The next morning the scandal dominated the kingdom. Newspapers printed stories. Gossip spread across noble circles. Some claimed Rosalie had attempted to manipulate the Duke. Others insisted she had been exposed before she could trap him into marriage. Very few people questioned the story. Why would they? The Duke himself had publicly condemned her. Rosalie remained inside her family's estate for several days. Visitors stopped arriving. Invitations disappeared. Friends suddenly became distant. It amazed her how quickly people changed when they believed a lie. 1 week later, she packed her belongings. Her father tried to convince her to stay. The scandal will fade. Rosalie shook her head. The scandal isn't the problem. Then what is? She looked toward the window. I can't remain in a place where every memory reminds me of what happened. Within days, she left the capital. No farewell party. No dramatic goodbye. She simply disappeared. Meanwhile, Julian tried to move on with his life. At first, he convinced himself he had done the right thing. Every time doubt appeared, he reminded himself of the letter. Yet the memory refused to leave him alone. The image of Rosalie standing in the ballroom, the look in her eyes, the way she had begged him to listen. Weeks became months. Then one afternoon, everything changed. One of Genevieve's former servants was arrested for theft. During questioning, the servant revealed something unexpected. She confessed to helping Genevieve obtain samples of Rosalie's handwriting. Investigators uncovered additional evidence. More witnesses came forward. Piece by piece, the truth emerged. The letter had been forged. Every word, every sentence, every accusation. Julian received the news while sitting alone in his study. At first he couldn't process it. He reread the report 3 times, then a 4th, then a 5th. The words never changed. Rosalie had been innocent, completely innocent. The room suddenly felt too small. Memories flooded his mind, her confusion, her tears, her voice. I didn't write this. She had told the truth, and he had chosen not to believe her. Before we continue, I have to ask you something. If the person you trusted most suddenly believed the worst about you without even hearing your side of the story, would you ever forgive them? Let me know in the comments. And if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the truth behind what happened to Rosalie is only beginning to unfold. Julian lowered the report onto his desk and buried his face in his hands. For the first time in his life, Duke Julian Ravenshire understood that some mistakes could not be undone with power, wealth, or influence. He had publicly humiliated an innocent woman before the entire kingdom, and now she was gone. The worst part was not knowing where she had gone. The worst part was knowing he deserved every mile of distance between them. For the next 6 months, Julian searched for Rosalie without success. He sent letters to distant estates, questioned former acquaintances, and even hired private investigators. None of it mattered. It was as though she had vanished from the kingdom entirely. At night he often found himself standing in the same ballroom where everything had fallen apart. The palace had hosted dozens of events since then, but every time he entered the room, he remembered only one thing: a young woman standing in tears while he pointed her toward the door. The memory haunted him. It followed him into meetings, dinners, and sleepless nights. Eventually the kingdom stopped talking about the scandal. Society always found new gossip, new scandals, new victims. Everyone moved on, everyone except Julian. One rainy afternoon nearly a year later, an elderly priest arrived unexpectedly at Ravenshire Manor. The man carried a small leather-bound notebook. "I believe this belongs to someone you're looking for," he said. Julian frowned. "Rosalie?" The priest nodded. "Lady Rosalie volunteers at our school." Julian's heart nearly stopped. After months of dead ends, he finally had an answer. 3 days later, he arrived. In a quiet countryside town, hundreds of miles from the capital. It wasn't a place noblemen visited. There were no grand estates, no lavish parties, no influential families, just simple homes, narrow streets, and ordinary people trying to build honest lives. As Julian stepped from his carriage, he noticed something unusual. Nearly everyone seemed happy. Children laughed in the streets. Shopkeepers greeted one another warmly. For reasons he couldn't explain, the atmosphere reminded him of Rosalie. Then he saw her. She stood beneath an old oak tree surrounded by children holding books. She was smiling. Not the polite smile she used at royal functions, a real smile, warm, genuine, alive. For a moment Julian simply stared. The woman before him looked different, stronger, more confident. The sadness he remembered had been replaced by peace. One little girl tugged Rosalie's sleeve. "Lady Rosalie, are you coming tomorrow?" Rosalie laughed softly. "Of course I am." The child hugged her before running away. Julian felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. The kingdom had lost her, yet somehow she had found herself. Rosalie noticed him a few seconds later. Her smile faded, not from anger, from surprise. Neither spoke. The silence stretched between them. Finally Julian stepped forward. "Rosalie." She held his gaze calmly. "Your Grace." The formality hurt more than he expected. Once she had called him Julian, without hesitation. Now he sounded like a stranger. "May we talk?" Rosalie hesitated before nodding. They walked toward a small garden overlooking the countryside. For several moments neither knew what to say. Julian had imagined this meeting hundreds of times. None of those rehearsed speeches seemed useful now. "I know about the letter," he finally said. Rosalie looked away toward the hills. "I assumed you would eventually." "It was forged. Yes. You were innocent." She gave a small sad smile. "I know." Julian swallowed hard. "Rosalie, I am sorry." The words felt pitifully inadequate. Sorry couldn't erase humiliation. Sorry couldn't erase betrayal. Sorry couldn't erase a year of loneliness. Rosalie remained silent. "I should have listened to you." Still silence. "I should have trusted you." This time Rosalie closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there were tears. Not because she was heartbroken, because hearing the truth came far too late. "Do you know what hurt most?" she asked quietly. Julian shook his head. "It wasn't the ballroom." His chest tightened. "It wasn't the gossip." She took a slow breath. "It was realizing how little faith you had in me." The words landed harder than any accusation, because they were true. Julian lowered his eyes. "You're right," Rosalie continued. 3 years, Julian. 3 years. If someone had handed me a letter claiming terrible things about you, I would have questioned it immediately." Julian couldn't argue. "I know. You didn't even ask for my side." "I know. You had already decided." The disappointment in her voice was worse than anger. Julian would have preferred she scream. Instead, she sounded tired of carrying pain he had caused. For the first time in his life, Duke Julian Ravenshire felt truly ashamed. Weeks passed. Julian remained in town. Not because Rosalie asked him to, because he refused to leave until he had done everything possible to make amends. He helped repair buildings damaged by storms. He funded books for local schools. He worked alongside volunteers. At first, many residents distrusted him. Gradually, they began to see his sincerity. Rosalie noticed it too. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't trying to buy forgiveness. He was simply trying to become a better man. Months later, the kingdom received shocking news. Duke Julian Ravenshire publicly confessed his mistake before Parliament and the royal court. He admitted he had wrongfully humiliated an innocent woman. He named Genevieve as the architect of the deception and accepted responsibility for believing the lie. The confession spread throughout the nation. For the first time, everyone learned what truly happened that winter night. Public opinion changed almost overnight. The same people who once whispered about Rosalie now praised her dignity. The same nobles who had avoided her now admired her strength. But unlike before, Rosalie no longer cared about their opinions. She had built a life that did not depend on society's approval. Nearly a year after Julian first arrived in the town, Another grand ballroom opened its doors. This time Rosalie attended by choice, not because she needed acceptance, not because she wanted status, simply because she was ready. As music filled the room, Julian approached her. He looked nervous, which would have shocked anyone who knew him years earlier. He stopped before her and offered his hand. "May I have this dance?" Rosalie stared at him for several seconds. Around them, hundreds of guests watched quietly. Once upon a time he had humiliated her before an entire ballroom. Now he stood before another ballroom waiting for her decision. The power belonged entirely to her. Slowly a small smile appeared on Rosalie's face. She placed her hand in his. The crowd exhaled. Julian looked as though someone had returned life to his lungs. As they stepped onto the dance floor, neither spoke. They didn't need to. Some wounds required time. Some trust required rebuilding. But for the first time in a very long while, both of them were moving in the same direction. Now it's your turn. After everything Julian did, publicly humiliating Rosalie, refusing to trust her, and forcing her to rebuild her life alone, would you have forgiven him, or would you have walked away forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below.